Sadly, at the moment, governments are grappling with how do they achieve biodiversity outcomes, carbon outcomes, and equity outcomes. And often they're looking to regulation to achieve these goals. But these regulations can happen at an international level, a federal level, a state level, a local level, and unfortunately they don't knit together. And so today we're going to talk to some experts here, and they're going to guide us through this maze of regulation that is currently coming, we have now, and also into the future. So we'll start with you, Francois. Francois works at ATIBT. She's the president of the organisation, and ATIBT promotes the development of sustainable and ethical and legal tropical timbers, and it's a renewable resource and also looks to the socio-economic benefits. So we'll hand over to you, Francois.
Thank you for giving me the first word. It's not easy to start, but I will try. Well, of course, the first regulation that comes to mind is the EUDR. And we heard the last days there has been a postponement of a year finally, but there are also some other amendments on the law, on the regulation, which are still, not really clear, because there's a new category of no risk. And this no risk, there are a lot of publications on LinkedIn that they say that, most of the countries will fit into the no risk zone. So that is not clear, and we still have to dig in that. But on the other hand, we must say that the certified companies, they were actually ready for the EUDR. They had everything done, and also the certification schemes prepared tools for them so they could actually respond to all this. The advantage was, of course, they already had the EUDR before, so they already had this due diligence was already in practice, so it was not new for them. And geolocalization, that was quite easy because they have the annual lots that they can log, and they are already defined by GPS points. So that was really not a problem. What was the problem? What we saw was, the information system, the declaration system, which was not really working as it should already, and slow and not explained, and still a lot of things to do. And customs were not ready. We had a forum, ATIBT had a forum early October in Belgium, and there the question was asked on the forum, and they boldly say, we are not ready. We don't know what we have to do. So bear that in mind, that was like 3 months before it actually was coming down. You actually saw it coming from a distance, that it was impossible to already apply it. But what is worrisome is you have the EUDR, but then you also have on the CITES species, you have the scientific review group from the EU that in a way kind of unilaterally puts extra criteria without taking into consideration the national legislations of the countries of product. And that is a real problem, because that's not a regulation, that's something like they impose. So if you don't comply with that, you cannot get an import status authorization. So that is. And
what would be the impact of that if you couldn't get that certification?
Every species, I can say, for instance, Afromosia is on the CITES 2 list. This is a valued species, and in social engagement clauses in DRC, it brings $5 cubic meter for the local development fund, which quite quickly gets important amounts that they have on annual basis and 5-year basis. But if these species, if you get other criteria added to that, and they cannot go to the European market anymore, then these species lose interest, or they will go to other markets where they're less demanding. And did we solve the problem? I don't think so, because the idea is to make sure that the species is well exploited and that it's sustainable. But I think we're just pushing it away by putting so many extra criteria and not looking at the national legislation, because these countries have their legislation and it's based on studies, so they know also what they are doing, so they should be respected on that, which is not the case.
So you're saying that regulation that's intended to achieve a good environmental outcome actually will end in a negative social outcome, and arguably perhaps that environmental outcome wouldn't be achieved either.
Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting.
And you can have even more explored, because if you see the quotas which are annually given, nearly all the countries don't get to that quota. But they might get now, because if the price compensation is not there, they will have to do a volume compensation, and so they will get to the quota. So it has an adverse effect on that. And we keep on saying this, and we also have proofs technically and scientifically what the situation of certain species is, and it has difficulties getting through. It's you have all these countries, they have the scientists, and some are not even forest experts, and some are there, you know, in butterflies and insects and plants and orchids, and say, I don't know if they have the whole qualification or the whole experience of Africa to look what it is actually. Okay. So that is a problem. And on top of that, yeah, you have the Congo Basin, who contributes 25% for the sustainability of the climate, and they only get 3% of the financing. So if you compare that, how can one expect that the country is at the same level when you don't even give the financing on that? So that's really, there are huge gaps there. And I must say the ministers of the Congo Basin were quite determined now to say that, you know, if we don't get the money, then we will use it otherwise.
Which is definitely going to be an adverse outcome.
Which definitely was going to be agricultural, that's for sure.
Yeah. Jennifer. So Jennifer is from the International Tropical Timber Organisation. That's an intergovernmental organisation promoting the sustainable management and conservation of tropical forests and the expansion and diversification of the timber trade. Now, a number of your members would have a great interest, obviously, in environmental sustainability, a number of the countries that you operate in. What do you have to say in relation to what Francoise said?
Well, let me start off by saying the positives of regulation, of why regulation is needed in some cases. And many times, additional regulation is needed when you need to force change in business supply chains or business practices where the existing factors do not force that change. And so let's take, for example, illegal logging, whether it was the EU timber regulation, the Lacey Act, the Prohibition Act that was put in by Australia. It drove a lot of change. It made businesses take a very hard look at their supply chains and their suppliers. It increased the scrutiny on the actual wood supply chains. It was a catalyst, I would say, for better coordination among different agencies who in the past did not have to actually coordinate that closely, like the customs agents, the law enforcement agents, the environmental agents. So in that sense, those type of regulations are good if they work properly. It also does attract, at least for a short period of time, donor-focused flow of finances toward that specific area. For example, you saw quite a lot of flow of finances toward governance issues when a lot of this illegal logging prohibitions are put in by both the consumer markets and also the producer members. Let's say you take EUDR. Even if you disagree with the approach, you cannot disregard that it has really highlighted that nexus between deforestation driven by agriculture, which is the main driver of deforestation in the tropics. Now, whether or not you agree with that approach, that's a whole different matter. ITTO is often asked, what is our stance when it comes to the EUDR? Our membership is both consumers and producers of tropical timber. So our role is not to take sides. It's to provide a platform for the issue to be discussed and to conduct studies and provide statistics that add clarity to the trade. So, you know, as this EUDR, for example, is being implemented, it may be interesting to track how it affects trade flows going forward. We did a very similar study when it came to the EU timber regulation. You know, the creation of effective environmental regulation is often dependent on a lot of factors that are not within control of the ministry that's actually implementing that regulation or even in control of that regulation. So it's very important that the regulation be sustainable and it meets different aims, environmental, economic, and social. Because if it doesn't actually meet that paradigm, it's not going to be resilient and it's not going to be implementable. Let's take, for example, EUDR. Francois mentioned a lot of the different aspects that were problematic for producers. In particular, no one has really thought about, okay, let's say you do leave those forests untouched and they're not touched by agriculture. What do you do with those forests? Because the fact is that those forests are home to 40% of the world's population. They have to have an economic value and they have to be used by that population in some way to provide their livelihoods and subsistence. That's where I think sustainable forestry definitely has a role to play. And I underscore the word sustainable, because if it's not sustainable, there's no way that we're going to meet our environmental objectives. And I think that's also where certification has a great role to play, because it provides third-party verification that you are doing sustainable forestry amongst different tools that are out there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jennifer. Over to you, Thorsten. So Thorsten is the Head of Advocacy at PEFC International. And we've talked a lot about sustainability certification, Thorsten, and I'm really keen to hear your reflections on the first two speakers, but also perhaps a quick explanation of what is sustainability certification.
Oh, thank you so much, and I think this is the right session to actually talk about it, because certification originated from the failure of governments to come up with a framework agreement on sustainable forestry at the 1992 Rio conference. That gave rise to what certification today is all about. What forest certification does is it sets requirements for what we understand sustainable forestry should be. And it verifies compliance with these requirements through audits, through independent audits in the forest. So while the EUDR sets requirements specifically on deforestation, and it controls it with spot checks in various countries, for example, the spot checks are 0.01% of the global trade that goes into Europe. For certification, it's annual. So forests are audited annually for compliance with requirements that don't only cover deforestation, but they also cover social and economic aspects in addition to the environmental aspects that of course go beyond deforestation.
And you have a complaints process through PEFC as well, don't you? So that engages the stakeholder or other community members if they feel like something is going astray. There is a mechanism through which they can...
Exactly. And I think that is also what we can learn, or what politicians and regulators can learn from what certification has been doing for the past 30 years. That in order to make change that is lasting and that is appreciated, and where local people actually take ownership of this change, is make them part of the change. Involve them in what is it that we want to achieve, what are the objectives that we want to achieve through our regulation, what are the objectives that we want to achieve within this forest. Companies, forest managers, smallholders, they are required to talk to communities, to talk to indigenous people, to identify what do we want to get out of this. How do we want this area to be managed? How do we want to promote environmental, social, and economic benefits that we have? And I think that is a fundamental difference, because regulation like EUDR is focused on avoiding harm, while forest management, or sustainable forest management, is focused on promoting good. And that is a fundamental decision that we have to reach ourselves. Where do we want to spend our efforts? Do we want to spend our efforts in trying to avoid harm? Or do we want to spend our efforts in promoting the good? If we then think about the impact, then PEFC, as the world's largest forest certification system, has certified 25% of the global production forests are sustainably managed in the past 30 years. EUDR, which only focuses on deforestation, is expected to cost between 170 million to 2.5 billion euros a year in terms of implementation, as estimated by the European Commission itself. Even if it takes this lower figure of 170 million annually, that is more than TEFC has spent in 25 years certifying a quarter of the global production. And we are promoting the good.
Yeah, and Francois, I wanted to just turn to you. Some of those, I guess we've had the EUDR has been designed. Are there some unintended consequences that have arisen from that? You were talking perhaps about money that's flowing into a community as a result of a forest, but have there been other implications in the Global South for some that you'd like to highlight in relation to EUDR?
Well, I think small and medium-sized companies will have more difficulties in responding to this. Because there are things that for big companies are, daily and since years. And talk to geo data, localization, internal, social external. Also, approving the deforestation, having all the elements, the images. Companies do have them because it's required, because they have their sustainable forest management plans. They need to every year introduce their operation plans. So they are all prepared, but the small and the medium-sized companies are falling out of that. And that preoccupies me in a sense that the Congo Basin countries are, as from 1st of January 2028, putting an embargo on export on logs. So all the timber has to be transformed. And I think what the idea, of course, is to create jobs. And then I think, like in a lot of countries, you have all these small and medium-sized companies that can do transformation of timber, and they can put on the market semi-finished or finished products.
Right.
And that will become another problem, to have the geodata and to have this done. I always imagined, like, for instance, in an industrial zone, companies that are there, they can have supplies which are legally checked, and they can come into the zone, and they use from different suppliers to smaller parcels of finished products. How are these SMEs going to keep on the geodata available? So that might also be a problem, to put in place the industrial plan that the countries are doing right now, or planning right now. That is, for one already. There are maybe other considerations that have to be taken into mind, like, this benchmarking is preoccupying the countries. And I don't think it will be a nice thing. I think it will be politically impacting, so we'll see how this works. But we need, for one, already to know what the no-risk countries will be.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So it sounds like there's some nuance that's needed when coming up with these sorts of regulations. So on that point, Jennifer, what should policymakers look to when they're making an environmental regulation in the timber space? What is a good way of doing that process?
Well, I think I pointed out already the notion of making sure that it's multiple objectives, that you're actually capturing not environmental goals, but also economic goals and social goals, and trying to mitigate where there are trade-offs. There is always going to be trade-offs. I just finished a presentation at the Indonesian Pavilion talking about the interplay of production forestry across the landscape with protected areas. So, it's up to societies and their governance system to determine what exactly is their trade-off. Are they going to emphasize biodiversity at the loss of economic return, or are they going to emphasize economic return and the livelihoods of their people? Are they going to make that the expense to conserve forestry? They can coexist, but I think we have to be real that there are trade-offs, and you have to explicitly recognize them and try to mitigate them when you're creating environmental policies. One of the things Francois was talking about is the effect of the EUDR on small and medium enterprises. I mean, this There are allowances within the regulation for small and medium enterprises, but that is small and medium enterprises putting the product on the EU market. There are many products that before they even reach the EU market are made by small and medium enterprises, and those enterprises still have to comply with all the geolocation, all the business reporting requirements that are required under the EUDR. So I think it's a little bit also a misunderstanding how supply chains work, particularly in the development of complex products and complex supply chains. And I think if I were to give some advice to policymakers, when you create policies like this, make sure you involve the people who actually run those businesses. And I think, it was pretty clear that there were a lot of businesses, even big businesses, that had an issue with some of the requirements underneath the EUDR. There's also a lot of question on how it's going to be monitored and what is the process of dispute settlement. I mean, what is the role of producer governments to dispute remote sensing data that is produced as evidence as deforestation? I talked about an opportunity for sustainable forestry underneath this, but even underneath sustainable forestry, the definition of degradation is one crafted by the EU, and it's highly limiting and not reflective of the differing circumstances in the local conditions. So I think that's also something that they have to address. I mean, I think they have to get past this whole benchmarking and also trying to just implement it. But when you start looking into the details, particularly on sustainable forestry, there are a lot of aspects of that degradation definition that will need to be worked through.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting. I'd be interested in your take on this, Thorsten, but some of your definitions within the PEFC standard forest management have been hard fought over a long time and have agreement from stakeholders, and they have differed from the definitions within the EUDR. Has there been a grappling within the PEFC about how to help members in that space?
Yes, there's definitely been some grappling, specifically because what we have been trying to do for the past 25 years is to work with the people on the ground within countries where those forests exist, to develop national standards to make sure that when it comes to definitions, when it comes to requirements, when it comes to the entire certification system, we are aligned with national priorities, with the unique circumstances in one country. Also to make sure that forest owners within that country can take ownership of their own system, because only if they have ownership, if it's not imposed from the outside, but it's what they themselves want, then we can have long-term sustainability of any such system. And that's at the core of PEFC. So yes, we have been grappling with the definitions that were imposed on us on deforestation and forest degradation. But also to reflect on something that Jennifer said, and also Françoise. To some extent, it feels like the EU has come up with a regulation which is much needed. So don't misunderstand me. It is much needed because it raises the floor for everyone, so that companies who act responsibly and sustainably are no longer at a disadvantage because they pay higher costs for responsibly sourced material and commodities. So that is tremendously important. But what hasn't been thought through is how this is actually implemented on the ground. And I've been feeling like the EU has been relying on actors such as certification system to actually support the implementation of it. And when it comes to timber, we always have to keep in mind, timber is among those commodities the one that is least affected. On the one hand, because if we look at which commodity contribute to deforestation, it is not timber. 95% of all timber globally comes from forests where deforestation is not the issue. So it's other commodities. But at the same point in time, the timber sector is also the sector where the vast majority, or not the vast majority, but where you have the highest percentage of certified material available, with more than 1/3 of all timber globally estimated to come from certified forests. And I found myself talking to other sectors that are affected by the EUDR about how the timber sector works and how chain of custody works, and how we do this and how we do that, and what the next step for their sectors could be in order to implement EUDR. And that's something that I find a little bit unfortunate and not well thought through, that we are taking on this role not only for our own sector and for responsible forest managers to be in compliance with the regulation, but also to support others. It's something that we gladly do, because in the end we're contributing to sustainable forest management and to avoiding deforestation. But it is something where I'd sometimes like to see a bit more appreciation as to the efforts that the entire sector has already been putting into managing commodity sustainably.
Because there has been an expectation. There has been an expectation on timber to make sure that it's doing the right thing. And I think everyone here representing timber members and consumers can say that the objective of the EUDR is welcomed by the forestry sector across the globe as a goal to achieve, and we want to see it succeed. But perhaps there's some nuance that's been missed, and hopefully in this period of time that we have now, as things get sorted through, we might see some refining to help those that this is supposed to be assisting. Perhaps we could run a little bit over time and have time for one question from the audience, if we have a question from the audience.
I might also have something to add.
Oh, do you?
Yes.
Well, perhaps we'll just take final comments then.
Well, I've seen the market has dropped, the EU has dropped over 30% for tropical timber. And we fear that is one reason. Of course, you have the economical crisis, but also the EUDR could be interfering in that and be on the basis of that.
As a preempting the EUDR.
So I used to say, maybe it's bizarre to say, buy tropical timber, certified tropical timber to maintain the tropical forest. But right now nobody's buying. So a forest without value goes away. It loses its value and it will be affected to someone else. So the continent of Africa will be the one who is going to be the biggest demographically. They will need timber and they will need forests to be cut down, degraded forest maybe, to do agriculture, because they need to feed their population, and they have a very young population. So if they want to have social and economical peace in their countries, then young people need to work. If they don't work, they do other stuff which is not really bringing a lot of peace in a country or a stability. So it is very important to continue buying tropical timber, but buy certified tropical timber. That is, for me, the message, the key message.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francois. Final comment, Jennifer?
Yeah, so just to build on something that Thorsten was saying about, the burden that's placed on the forestry sector to prove its sustainability, and particularly certification systems and the role they play. I think going forward as the EU and others, the EUDR is implemented and other regulations, it's I think an important resource, the auditors who actually do the certification process, because they actually are the ones who speak to the forest operators and owners. And many times, if something is not, a criteria is not being accomplished or fulfilled, it's not because they don't want to do it. Sometimes that's the case, but most of the time it's because there's a conflicting regulation in the country, or for whatever reason it's too burdensome or it's too costly. These are the types of feedback that I think are incredibly important to go for the messaging to come back to the EUDR or any regulator for that matter, to really inform them and to help the policy evolve. There's this notion that, well, it's a regulation, it can't be changed. Humans make regulations, and humans can change the regulations. It all just depends on political will, hopefully underscored by scientific evidence, which hopefully the auditors and other people in the forest sector are able to give them. So I just want to end by saying that when I was telling ITTO's role in all of this, it's not just a platform for policy discussion and also studies and transparency in trade market data. It's also, we do implement projects on the ground that help build producer countries' capacity to comply with these regulations. So,
Thank you very much. Final comments, Thorsten?
Thank you. regulations such as the EUDR successfully are raising the floor, but what we need to do is we need to raise the bar. And we need to raise the bar in a manner that takes everyone along. Certification is an amazing tool to support everyone involved, from the smallholders, from the forest manager, from the SME, to the regulator and to the politician in finding a space to dialogue, to exchange views, and to implement what we all want, which is sustainable forest management. We are ready to do so, and let's hope that we can raise the bar together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panellists. It's been a really interesting conversation, and it's an evolving one right now with EUDR changes. There's 2 key changes happening last week on the EUDR. So we hope that some of the EU policymakers were listening in today and may take on some of the wise advice coming from this panel. Thank you all for attending today.